so today, like I said, we are starting chapter 7, the title of which is Balancing Nationalism and Sectionalism. So let's talk about those two words first. We're going to hear a lot about nationalism here in the beginning of all of this. And we talked about that in the end of chapter 6. What is nationalism? Yes. Yes. Nationalism is this extreme pride in the country, extreme pride in the nation, which sounds an awful lot like patriotism, and in some ways it is. It is a similar kind of pride or love for your country or those kind of things, but nationalism is a bit more specific. It is a feeling of unity, a feeling of nationhood, a sense of the United States being united, a sense of the United States being one thing. It is also a sense of, identity, of what America meant, of what, having unique characteristics that were unique to Americans and could be seen as special, and things that people were valuing and really celebrating that uniqueness. And what some, it really is not new, but it was certainly reviving this idea of American exceptionalism, that Americans were somehow exceptional, exceptions to the rule, different, chosen, favored in some kind of a way. Again, it's not entirely new, but it becomes a huge part of the conversation, and it just infuses itself into everything, nearly everything, in the years following the War of 1812, nationalism. Sectionalism, however, we talked about sectionalism just a little bit. We mentioned that word and what it meant. What did we say sectionalism was? Right, division based on region. We talked about that, if you remember, with Washington's farewell address, how Washington warned against sectionalism. Don't divide yourself up based on region. So would you say that nationalism and sectionalism, are they similar things or are they a different thing? They're different things. They're almost like polar opposites. So nationalism is this feeling of, one nation first, national government over the states, all those sorts of things. Sectionalism is the exact opposite of that. And the thing is, in this time, we actually do see both. We tend to see it as, first we'll talk about the nationalism part of it, and there is this great sense of unity, and we're going to see that nationalism show up in economic programs to strengthen the economy, in court cases that strengthen the national government, in foreign policy. It even shows up in cultural things, in art and literature, Americans exploring their own culture and celebrating that. It even shows up there. But interestingly enough, it also breeds, in a way, sectionalism, because some of these nationalistic policies, as we're going to see, tend to favor or tend to work better for some regions of the country more than others. And so it does, in the end, ironically, cause more division after a while. So we see all those things kind of playing out over time here. Okay, so keep in mind the effects of the War of 1812, the outcomes of the War of 1812. Keep all those things in your mind, because all the things we're looking at today are related to that, or most of the things we're looking at today are related to the War of 1812 and the years immediately following it. So, the War of 1812, as we discussed, it ends technically in a stalemate, technically in a tie. No territory changed hands. The United States did not expand at that particular moment. But how did most Americans perceive the end of the War of 1812? Yeah, they're going to see that as a victory. That's part of the reason for that extreme pride, this sense of, we did it again. We, beat the odds again, contributing to that idea of American exceptionalism and all of those things. The period after the War of 1812 is known, or is called, the era of good feelings. So this time period after the War of 1812, so through about the 1820s, it doesn't really have exactly, these sorts of things don't have real concrete dates to them. But certainly from the time the War of 1812 ends in 1815 through sometime early to mid-1820s or so, depending on how you look at it, known as the era of good feelings. So that refers to this post-war of 1812 period. The president during the era of good feelings was James Monroe. So James Monroe is your era of good feelings president. So we kind of associate him with that era of good feelings, even though he just happens to preside over it. So that is another way to characterize it, is as the presidency or the administration of James Monroe, the fifth president. Now, as far as why it's called an era of good feelings, what's that all about? Well, some of that has to do with that heightened nationalism after the War of 1812. That's part of the good feelings, okay? We're proud of our country. We are excited for our country's future. That sense of American exceptionalism, that sense that America's future was so promising, that there were so many wonderful things to come, and there was going to be such prosperity. And there was a lot of prosperity during that time. The War of 1812 stimulated a lot of economic growth, and we're going to see a lot of economic growth and economic expansion during the era of good feelings. And so that is part of that name, good feelings. Some of that has to do with prosperity. Not only was the war over and we're at peace now, but there's economic growth that's taking place, a lot of economic changes that we're going to talk about here in just a few moments. So that's part of it, is people were seeing the economy growing, more money to be made, more opportunities, new products to buy. That kind of prosperity was quite exciting, therefore, good feelings. It also has to do with the political situation. Think back into the War of 1812. What happened at the end of that conflict regarding political parties?
The Federalists were distributed.
Yes, the Federalist Party, remember, is gone. So the Federalists are no more during this time. So what are you left with? Just Republicans. So part of that good feelings is this seeming lack of political division. It looks like, it's not really true, but it looks like we've moved past all those political divisions. We've moved past the days of this party against that party. We've moved past all those disagreements that we used to have. And everybody's on the same page now. Everybody thinks the same thing. I'm exaggerating. Of course, that's not true. But it does at least seem that way on the surface, because all you have is the Republican Party. There's no other major party to oppose them at that point. So it seems, again, on the surface, and some people did truly believe that the days of political parties were over, that was something that was kind of a little growing pain we had to go through at the beginning there, but we've moved past that, and we're all good now. Because remember that political parties were never intended to begin with. That wasn't something people wanted or thought would happen. And so there was a perception that, we moved past that. It was kind of old news. So part of this era of good feelings is this seeming lack of bitterness, all that ugly back and forth that had been going on for so long. It seemed to have ended. Obviously, that, like I said, that's not really true. Because what we'll see is that the Republican Party just becomes divided amongst itself, and eventually it splits by the end of this era of good feelings. So it is referring to this prosperity, this peace. One of the reasons that Monroe doesn't get near as much attention as some other presidents is he happens to preside over an era in which there's not a whole lot of major problems to deal with. But so he's associated with this era of good feelings. So let's talk about what some of those changes that were coming to the country were, economic changes that are part of this era of good feelings that are also related to the War of 1812. This other revolution that starts to come to the United States about this time is the Industrial Revolution. We have talked before about how, and I kept saying, at this point the United States is not industrialized. The United States is not really manufacturing any of its own products. Well, that is about to change. So first, let's define what the Industrial Revolution is, what are we talking about, and then talk about how it came to the United States and what it meant for the United States. So when you think of the Industrial Revolution, what are some of the things that pop into your head? Yes. Factories, machines, child labor, anything else? Yep. Transportation to go along with it. Yes, all that. So Industrial Revolution means, of course, the beginnings of complex machines, the beginnings of machinery to make products. It's a completely new way of production, having production being done by complex machinery. It is the beginning and meaning of factories. So factories full of machines and workers operating machines to create products instead of an individual person or an individual craftsman that's making clothing or that's making furniture, having machinery that's doing that work and factories that are doing that. What does it mean for the Industrial Revolution? What does it mean as far as the amount of production that can take place? It increases, yes. We're talking about mass production. Industrial Revolution means mass production, making products on a large, grand scale. Instead of one individual craftsman that maybe is making, I don't know, 4 or 5 pairs of shoes a day, that might be a stretch, I don't know. A factory that's pumping out hundreds of pairs of shoes or thousands or more. So mass production, mass distribution as well. What does that mean, mass distribution? Yeah, and it's going where? All over. So it's not just that individual craftsman that's probably just producing locally, for people in the area, people in the region or whatnot, but things that are being shipped all over the world. So we mean beginnings of machinery, of, automation and what we might call it, workers in factories tending to machines and large-scale production, large-scale distribution. Now, you may recall from world history that the Industrial Revolution certainly does not begin in the United States, and at first it's rather slow to come to the United States. Where did the Industrial Revolution start? In Britain. The British are the ones that started all, and they have been industrialized for quite some time, and it does not come to the United States for a few decades. The United States takes a while to get behind it. Let's talk about some of the reasons why the United States is a little bit slow to industrialize. One of the reasons is, I'm putting up here that this was Jefferson's view of industrialization, but it wasn't just Jefferson. Jefferson kind of is the face of it. But this was a belief that a lot of people had about industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. And we kind of even already have a conception of this from some of those readings that we did about Jefferson several weeks ago. But Jefferson's view, and again, he wasn't the only one. A lot of people shared this view. He was just the most prominent person to really vocalize this kind of view and really be a face for it. But Jefferson didn't want industrialization to ever come to the United States, and a lot of people did. Saw industrialization as potentially harmful. Think back to those readings we did. What kind of a country, what kind of an economy did Jefferson envision? Mostly farmers. Yeah, he envisioned this very peaceful, pastoral, farming nation, a nation of small farmers, all those kind of people. And industrialization, was just the opposite of that. That was something that he just did not want and didn't see that as conducive to the kind of country, the kind of democracy, and all those kind of things that he wanted and that he saw the United States to be. Jefferson and a lot of folks that agreed with him felt like industrialization was not democratic, and that industrialization caused far more problems than it solved. When they looked at industrialization, they saw a lot of negative things that came along with it, a lot of downsides, a lot of bad things, and they didn't want that stuff to come to the United States. What kind of things do you think they were talking about, stuff that they downsides to it? Okay, so certainly skilled labor would not be as in demand. Yeah, you have this class of wealthy business owners that gain a lot of power.
They just gain power over the lower class.
Yeah, and think about, what about that lower class? Go ahead, what you want to say? What now? Okay. Perhaps quality of products for sure. What are some of the things when you think about like industrialized Britain? After a few years of factories and all those kind of things, what were some problems that they had with that? Pollution and, what about the people working in these factories? Sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. They're thinking of all those things like you get pollution, it's filthy, you get crowded cities, you get people working in these factories for nothing, that are poor, that are destitute, that are living in squalor, all those things. And remember, Jefferson has this image of the small farmer who's free, who is totally free. He's not dependent on anybody, he owns his own land, all this sort of thing, and he saw factory work as, and he called it slavery. I'd probably from the slave owner to say that. But he saw that as not freedom, that you were, run by the clock and you had to do exactly what and it was very robotic and monotonous and all these sorts of things. So not only was it, it was dirty and you get labor disputes and you get really, really rich people and really, really poor people, but it was essentially not a free kind of work, and that it was basically some like industrial enslavement. So a lot of people held that view and didn't want industrialization to come to the United States for that reason, didn't want those things. That view, though, however, people start to change their minds about that during the War of 1812. We mentioned that the War of 1812 kind of spurs on more American manufacturing. People start to see industrialization as necessary. People start to see industrialization as necessary because saying, and this is related to nationalism, we don't need to be dependent on somebody else. We don't want to be dependent on Europe for manufactured goods. They saw that as being part of the reason why the United States got involved in the War of 1812 was we were far too dependent on them. And therefore, when they started taking our ships and everything, that really affected us. We had no leverage, no recourse to stop them other than to fight the war with them. We need to be more independent so those kind of things don't happen. And again, that sense of nationalism, that sense of pride in that we're just as capable as they are. We're just as innovative as they are. We should be able to, be an industrial competitor in the world as well. We shouldn't let Britain have all the fun with that sort of thing. So people are changing their mind about that, and some are starting to see industrialization as necessary, as important, as something that should happen and that can, and all those sorts of things. But another reason, even if that wasn't the case, another reason why industrialization was kind of slow to come to the United States was they didn't possess the technology. Americans just simply did not have the technology. Britain really already had monopolies on just about everything, because they had been producing it for so much longer. What does that mean if they had monopolies?
It's just like they have influence.
Yeah, so they pretty much control it. They're the ones that have already been producing these goods. They can produce it better. They can produce it cheaper. That's a big thing. Is that manufactured goods in Europe, they can do it for a lot less money because they had more experience doing it. They can do it faster. They have more, something you'll learn in economics called economies of scale. They have that. So they were able to do things a lot more cheaply. And so even if there were Americans that wanted to industrialize it, wanted to start a factory or a mill or something like that, they would have found it difficult because they would have only been able to produce a little bit, whereas Britain could produce a lot, and it would have been a lot more expensive. Also, the British are very, very secretive about their technology, as you can imagine they would be. They have very strict rules, actually very strict laws that prevented their techniques, their plans, their practices, all that information about how they built those machines and how everything worked. That was all under tight control, and there were very specific laws there about keeping it under tight control. Why didn't they want that technology getting out anywhere? They don't want anybody else doing it, right? Companies today are the same way. We call that intellectual property. They don't want other companies, their competitors, getting their hands on it so they can copy it. So even if there were Americans that wanted to industrialize, they would have found it difficult because they just simply didn't possess the technology. Now, we know that the view of industrialization was changing partially because of the War of 1812. People were starting to see it as more necessary. The monopoly thing also is affected by the War of 1812 because during the war years, trade was so disrupted. There were times that trade was very limited or even flat out cut off. And so that gave American manufacturers, those that were just sort of starting out, kind of gave them a chance to get their foot in the door, kind of gave them a chance to sort of slip in and take the place, and that kind of allowed them to sort of get started. So that was helping there. However, that doesn't work for the secrecy thing. The way that that is kind of, I guess fixed is sort of a weird word to use, but the way the United States kind of gets the technology is because of this person, Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater is credited with bringing industrialization to the United States. Hard to imagine all that being brought over by one person, but this person kind of started it all. So he is credited with bringing industrialization to the United States. Samuel Slater did that basically by memorizing British technology. He immigrated from Britain, and he had been around all of that stuff and basically memorized it. Just had it all in his brain. How the machines worked, what the parts looked like, how it was all put together, how their factories were laid out. Those are the kind of things that any sort of drawings or plans or schematics, all that kind of stuff, it was illegal to transport any of those things. And so Samuel Slater smuggles it in his head and brings all that to the United States, and he starts some of the first factories using some of those kinds of machines in the United States. So it kind of takes off from there. And of course it takes off small. It's not like he comes over and starts this big giant, conglomerate factory. These would have been very, very small, cottage-based industry, probably no bigger than the room we're in, very small with maybe just a few machines. It's something that grows very, very gradually. So Samuel Slater starts some of the very first factories in the United States. And just like it was in Britain, do you recall what industrialization kind of took off with first? Well, that's the kind of labor. If you remember the textiles, yes. And that's the same thing in the United States. So when the Industrial Revolution first gets started, it is mostly with textile factories. So that's the first industry to become successful in the United States is textiles. And what is textiles? Yeah, fabric, using cotton or wool or other kinds of materials to make fabric that could then be made into clothing or upholstery for furniture, different things like that. So textile factories, these are looms. The machines are these looms that weave the fibers together to make cloth. Now, the Industrial Revolution, as you can probably imagine, it's not taking off everywhere in the United States. What region of the United States do you think this is happening in? The North, yes, specifically New England. It specifically takes off in New England, which is where Samuel Slater had immigrated to, and New England was well suited for it. You had a higher population, more cities where you would have people that would be available and were looking for jobs. You had, this is before electricity, so a lot of times these things were powered by water, steam and stuff, and they needed water to, spin the little wheels and all that kind of thing. And New England had not of natural waterfalls and kind of the right sort of fall line for that to happen. So it is mostly in New England, or you could say the North, where this is happening, of course. So in the North is changing economically. We know it's always been more diverse. We know that it's always been more different kinds of things going on there. And now we're seeing the advent of industry. And that, of course, is going to transform the whole United States, but definitely make the North take on a very specific kind of characteristic and make it very different from the South and from the West. Now, nationalism, again, that partially fed into the industrialization thing. Some people began to see industrialization as necessary in order for the United States to be strong, and the United States needed to be able to compete with other industrial powers of the world, all those sorts of things. But a big way in which we're going to see economic nationalism is through our whole program, a whole economic package that's going to be proposed and implemented in the era of good feelings, known as the American system, which is designed and advocated by Henry Clay. We've mentioned Henry Clay before, very, very briefly. What did we say about Henry Clay? He was one of the war hawks, right? So he was one of the war hawks, and remember I said these were some of the people that were just sort of beginning their political careers, and we're about to see them all the time. Like I said, Henry Clay is one of them. So we're going to be seeing a lot of Henry Clay. So he was a war hawk, and Henry Clay was and will always be a big nationalist. He is in favor of national strength, national power, and we're going to see that throughout his political career, but particularly with his American system. So we're going to look at the different parts of the American system and what all it's for. But even before we do that, so this is going to be a nationalistic program, but even before we know what this is in it or what it has anything to do with, what already kind of suggests nationalism here? It's the American system, it is, kind of invokes this sense of country, nation, and, we're going to do something to improve the overall economy. Henry Clay's American system, the purpose is to strengthen the economy, stimulate economic growth. We want the economy to grow and be strong, so we're going to do things to create that or to stimulate that. And to literally bind the country together. Bring it together. Not so much in an emotional sense, you'll see what I mean in a moment, but it is about stimulating economic growth, bringing about economic growth and economic stability, but also binding the country together. So that's sort of the overall purpose, the overall vision that Henry Clay has for his American system. It consists of 3 parts. So we're going to look at these 3 parts of the American system and talk about what they are and how they try to accomplish those goals. Okay, I'm trying to make the economy stronger and bind the country together, and how they are examples of nationalism. Okay, how this is a nationalistic program besides just its name. The first of these, he wants a second Bank of the United States. Basically, all that means is he wants to bring back the national bank that they used to have. Let me go back just a second. Remember the national bank that had been established in the 1790s? That had originally expired, just like any other kind of government program. Stuff like that had to be renewed by Congress, reauthorized by Congress every so often. It was up for renewal sometime early 1800s. I can't remember exactly when. Republicans were in control by that point, and remember that they never liked the national bank, so they had let it expire. So there had not been a national bank for several years. So this is not like a second bank of second national bank or second bank of the United States, so that there's 2 of them. It is resurrecting the old one. It is bringing that back. It had expired. There had not been a national bank for a while. Henry Clay wants to bring that back. So restarting, rechartering, national bank part 2. But it's the same idea, the exact same thing. So this is about the same things that it was about the first time. It is about, strengthening the finances. It is about, getting money flowing so that there can be economic development. That you get money out there so people can borrow money to start a business or borrow money to fund this project or something. That stimulates that economic growth and creates a stronger financial system. So that's part of it, a recharter of the national bank. He also wants, as part of the American system, protective tariffs. We've talked about tariffs before. What were tariffs? Yes. Taxes on imports. Okay, so taxes on imports. There have always been tariffs. They have never gone away, but Henry Clay wants new tariffs that are a lot higher. Now, part of the reason for tariffs and why you would increase tariffs, and he's talking about some pretty hefty tariff increases here. We've talked about a big reason for that, and most other tariffs, so it's not entirely a new idea because there's been tariffs before, but they were mostly what you would call revenue tariffs, meaning that their purpose was really to raise revenue for the government, so the government would have money to operate, money to do what it needs to do. And that was the primary way governments got money in these days. Mostly it was through tariffs, this was before income taxes. But this one is more a protective tariff than anything else. We've talked about this concept as well. How can tariffs protect something, and what can they protect? Yes, they can protect American businesses. They can protect American manufacturing. Make sure we understand how that works. Because if you put a tariff on something, you put a tariff on imports, put a tariff on European goods, what happens to the price? Price goes up. So what are people more likely to buy? The American-made thing. Less likely to buy the import. It is about discouraging foreign competition. It's about giving those American manufacturers, which remember, industrialization is happening, and he's trying to give those American manufacturers an edge, trying to give them a little bit of an advantage so they can compete with those European manufacturers that can do things a lot more cheaply. If you weren't for tariffs, then European goods would be a heck of a lot cheaper than American-made ones, okay? So that's the reason for those tariffs. Yes, it will provide some income, and that is part of what he wants. But this one also it is really more for protection than anything else, protecting those businesses that are just starting to get off the ground. Now, up until now, this all should sound a little bit familiar. Does it remind you of anything? Yes? It should remind you of Hamilton's financial plan, because it's exactly where Henry Clay got the idea. He is resurrecting a lot of those old Hamiltonian ideas. The National Bank, that was Hamilton, tariffs were Hamilton, and the exact same reasoning behind it. So I'll come back to that in just a second. The third part of the American system, something called internal improvements. Internal improvements means transportation systems. And we'll use that word internal improvements a lot to refer to transportation systems, mainly roads and canals. Okay, roads and canals. Now later, internal improvements will also include railroads. At this point it doesn't, because railroads hadn't been invented yet. But just keep that in your mind that once you get past about 1840 or so, when people are talking about internal improvements, they mean roads, canals, and railroads as well. But transportation systems. Remember that part of the purpose of the American system was to bind the country together, and that's what those internal improvements are doing. They are literally connecting the country together, connecting different regions together so that things can move more quickly, and that economic growth can be stimulated. Remember, that's part of the overall purpose. Also, remember the War of 1812 had exposed how deficient the United States was in that area, that there were not good roads connecting different regions. That was why the invasion of Canada had failed. That was why a lot of things did not go well, because it took so darn long to get anything, whether it was people, whether it was trade products, whether it was information. It took months, to get it from this state to that state, literally weeks and months. And so the idea was we build roads, we build canals, connect things together. And the other thing that Henry Clay wants with this, what makes this nationalism, is he's talking about federally funded internal improvements, federally funded roads and canals. What would that mean, federally funded? Yes? Yes, the national government does this, and the national government pays for it. That's what makes this such a nationalistic program. He is suggesting that the national government pay for that stuff, that they are the ones that initiate the buildings of roads and canals instead of individual states, or instead of local areas or private companies, that the national government foot the bill for this. And that does not sound unusual to us, but in these days that was highly new. The idea that the national government would pay to build a road, that was seemed kind of crazy to some people. And that's part of also what the protective tariffs are for. Yes, it would protect business, but it would also provide the revenue, the money, to fund these internal improvement projects, these roads and canals and such. And that's part of the roads and canals means economic growth, because that means that the industrial products that are being produced in the north, now we can actually get them somewhere. We can get them to the west. We can get farm products from those western states where they need to go. So it is all about increasing commerce, increasing trade, and making an overall stronger economy. This is nationalistic because we already talked before about how the national bank is an enhancement of national power. It relies on the implied powers and the elastic clause and loose construction of the Constitution. That's nationalism. Tariffs, you're talking about the national government, again, using that power to bring in more revenue, and internal improvements, incredibly nationalistic. So make sure you know how all these things work, how they accomplish those goals of the American system, but also how they were examples of nationalism. Now, again, oddly enough, these are all things, except for the internal improvements, which was probably something Hamilton may have had in the back of his mind, but wasn't directly a part of his financial plan. These were, resurrected old ideas, and Hamilton, remember, and those that supported these things before, what political party were they affiliated with? They were Federalists. Republicans, what did they think about all this stuff? They hated it. Jefferson didn't like any of this. So, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, the Federalists are gone, but their ideas are not. The things that they stood for are not. In fact, they are being adopted now by some Republicans. Clay is a Republican. They're all Republicans right now. So they have changed their minds about that stuff. A lot of that younger crowd saw the advantages of stronger federal power. The War of 1812 had kind of shown them that, or at least made them feel that way, that there was something to be said for stronger federal power. There was something to be said for a stronger financial system and all those kind of things. And some of them are actually saying maybe Hamilton was right about that. That's exactly what Henry Clay thinks. And so they're resurrecting those things. So, like I said, the idea about strong national government and all that didn't go anywhere. And in fact, a lot of Republicans are now believers in those things, but not all of them. Because the American system, it will go through. The second bank of the United States is going to be chartered. We'll talk more about that. And it will ignite the same debate about it that it already has. So we're going to see that come back. Protective tariffs are enacted. Tariffs do go up. Internal improvements is the one that's a little bit less specific. There were some internal improvement buildings. Okay, let me put it this way. There were tons of internal improvement projects being done in this time. However, most of it was not being done by the federal government. Most of it was done by states or by local governments. There were only a small handful of roads and such that the national government actually built, because a lot of people, including President Monroe, felt that that was too much. That was too far for the federal government to extend. President Monroe actually vetoed a lot of the initiatives to build those things. So there's tons of internal improvement building, but in actuality, most of it is being done by states and local governments and all of that. So we will see, particularly that national bank issue is going to come back. We're going to see a court case about that very soon. And then we'll see it again when we get to Andrew Jackson, because he goes after it. So what we'll be looking at tomorrow are some of those court cases, ways that the judicial branch weighs in on nationalism. Okay.